Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this Provost Seminar on Beyond Grades, How Do We Represent Student Accomplishment? My name is Matt Kaplan. I'm the Executive Director of CRLT, and we've been organizing these Provost Seminars for 19 years now, twice a year, on a teaching and learning topic of interest to the Provost's office and the broader campus community. Each time, we try to invite faculty with a special interest in the topic, and in this case, we cast a very wide net, including faculty interested in building engaged learning practices into their courses and programs, including TLTC grantees, faculty recognized for outstanding teaching, including Thurnow professors and CRLT grantees, faculty whose teaching involves high-impact practices, such as first-year seminars and writing intensive courses, academic leaders responsible for undergraduate ed, and staff who support and collaborate on these efforts, and we're glad you could join us today. I'd like to begin by recognizing the outstanding team that developed and organized and took the lead on today's seminar. Melinda Matney, CRLT's Director of Assessment, worked closely with Vice Provost James Holloway, who is somewhere over there, on the overall planning of this event. On the back of your agenda, you have a list of the steering committee that thought carefully about ways to engage you all in this topic. Laura Gonzalez Garcia, back there, was responsible for the many complex logistics of the day, including the lunch we will enjoy. And Fernando Mora and Lisa Toon, Lisa's back there and Fernando's there, collaborated on the poster fair. Let's give them all a big hand. This seminar topic grows out of CRLT's collaboration with Vice Provost James Holloway on the Transforming Learning for a Third Century, or TLTC, initiative. TLTC was designed to promote engaged learning, that is, those experiences in which students work in unscripted, authentic settings where stakeholders are invested in the outcome. The learning that takes place as a result of those experiences is not easily conveyed by a traditional grading system. And beyond TLTC, groups across campus and across the country are grappling with this question more broadly. How can students convey to those who review their records for hiring or admissions a more complex and nuanced sense of what they've gained from their time on campus and beyond? And similarly, how can consumers of student records, admissions committees, and employers, for example, gain a deeper understanding of capacities of the applicants they are reviewing? This Provost Seminar is designed to allow colleagues at U of M to explore the implications of new approaches for individual instructors and for the institution more broadly. In terms of how the conversation will proceed, we'll begin with Professor Ethan Hutt from the University of Maryland, who will talk to us about the history of the current A through F grading scheme. When charting a course for the future, it's useful to know how we got here, and Professor Hutt will provide that for us. Then you'll have an opportunity to visit this poster fair set up around the ballroom and just outside the entrance there to explore a range of examples of how student accomplishment is being documented at U of M and nationwide. And the fair includes a strolling lunch, as you see, so that we will have food for thought on 2 levels. We will then reassemble for a set of lightning talks that will be convened by U of M Professor Barry Fishman, and the speakers include U of M students, a representative of industry, and U of M faculty talking about how they use their record of accomplishment to make decisions or represent themselves. You will then have a chance to gather with colleagues from related disciplines in breakout rooms to discuss the implications of what you've seen today. And we will end back here in the ballroom for dessert and discussion with Vice Provost Holloway about next steps. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ethan Hutt, who will get the day started for us. He has his PhD from Stanford and is now an assistant professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning, Policy and Leadership at the University of Maryland. His research examines the way in which the law has defined the purpose, organization, and success of public education in America, and, relevant to our conversation, he has published articles on the history, development, and implications of metrics in American education, including grades, standardized tests, evaluation systems, and value-added models. And we had the pleasure of having dinner with him last night, and I know he's a very thoughtful person, and you're going to enjoy what he has to say. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I understand that everything runs on Michigan time around here, but I promise the conveners that my talk will operate on my German grandfather's time, so I will hit precisely 30 minutes so that we have time to chat. So what I want to do is provide you a history of grading today, and to provide you some basic questions that might guide us as we have a talk today about the future of grading. And the basic argument that I want to make to you, or proposal I want to offer to you, is that the history of student records and grading is really a history of negotiations between a series of constituents, essentially. Institutions within and across sectors, institutions and their students, and then institutions and the government. And that if we want to reimagine student grades and student transcripts, we need to contemplate these relationships. So it's impossible to study the history of grading just as the history of grading. It becomes too entangled in these other things about where grades go, where students go, where they're coming from. And so there's a series of enduring questions that I want to put out on the table that may be of relevance. I know you're concerned about the history, or about redefining grading and transcripts at the University of Michigan, but I would encourage you to think about the peripheral, who else is going to be an audience for the grades that you develop and the transcripts, and how to think about those. So a series of enduring questions that have stalked the history of grading and the history of student records. The first is, which institutions should record what info, experiences, or achievement on the record? So what actually gets written down, and what kinds of things? Who should recognize and honor this information? So who's going to validate it, and who's going to receive it and do what with it? How and by whose authority should new types of students' programs be recognized? So we're in an era of micro-credentials, of students taking classes online. So it's important that we think about, and this was a long-term challenge, what actually gets on the transcript and by whose authority. And so historically, I would pose, and this I hope is something that will encourage you as you think about this throughout the day, is that historically answers to all of these questions have not come from the government. This is a distinction that is true of higher education, but maybe less so with K-12. But they've come from individual and collective institutional action. So leaders have taken steps to answer these questions and have defined whole fields as a result. And I'm going to try to show you a little bit of that today. Less interesting for the non-historians in the room, I think you can sort of periodize the history of grades and records as there's an early period of essentially early system building. Then there's the massive system expansion where you finally grapple with the problem that students are not self-contained. They're shared between institutions and move back and forth constantly between institutions, which poses a whole set of new challenges. And then you have a period, I think, that we're currently in, and that I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention, which is that we have a period of system scrutiny, where institutions are not just accountable to themselves, but to, I'm at the University of Maryland, I know you're a public institution, though not by government funding, that there's an oversight element that we can't ignore as we think about these things. Okay, so to start, you have to start a history with Horace Mann. And if you look at the early history of schooling, the thing that stands out is how decentralized and idiosyncratic educational practices are. So in his first annual report, Horace Mann says, while the state in the administration of its military functions establishes a separate department, fills the statute books with pages of minute regulations and formidable penalties, so that the fact of every missing gunflint and primary wire may be detected, transmitted, and recorded among its archives, it prescribes no means of ascertaining how many of its children are deserters from what should be the nurseries of intelligence and morality. So of course he's talking about we have no idea how many students are attending schools. And this obviously has strong implications for how we measure student achievement, because if you don't know who's in the building, you don't know what you should be recording and how you should measure it. And part of the reason that no one knew who was in and out of the schools was that early ideas of schooling and grading, this is a picture of the Lancaster model if you're familiar with it, it's rows of children lined up, and what you see here are monitors. And the whole idea of the assessment in this model is that it's completely dynamic and fluid, minute to minute and day to day. So you would have monitors come and quiz students on their lectures. If they got it right, they moved up. If they got it wrong, they moved back. They would reassemble constantly. And there was a command at the end of the day that was take down the lists. And it was a list of students who were at different stations. And the idea was that they had attained something in that day. And at the end of the day, it came down and you started over the next day. So grading was totally epiphenomenal. And it was totally self-contained in the classroom. Horace Mann complaining about the lack of student records, who's in the room, was immaterial because it all happened day to day. And this was the earliest model of grading that we have. The other early model of grading was called emulation. It basically involved oration, where often towns would gather, cities would gather, the students would stand out on the stage, and the teacher would call out usually pre-selected and pre-rehearsed questions, and the students would recite the answers, and everyone would be duly impressed by the decorum that had been maintained. Sometimes you would get visiting schoolmasters, like here's Horace Mann sitting there, like Abe Lincoln would eventually, sitting there and listening and hearing, and you'd have a teacher, and it was all oration. And the idea was that a student's ability to perform on command, that was the marker of a well-trained, well-educated student. You even get handbooks in the 19th century that offer the most effective gestures, I think, effective gestures for communicating your message to the audience so that you make a good impression on students. One of the problems with this system was that people thought it emphasized the wrong things. It emphasized a performance rather than some kind of learning. It was epiphenomenal. It involved competition almost minute to minute. And people began to wonder whether this was really all that grades should measure and whether it was really a sort of an effective model for education. And so you begin to see in the mid to late 19th century, colleges begin to experiment with more information-rich systems that are not just performative. And one of the things that they begin to do is they begin to include a non-academic component. So many early grading systems involve basically a demerit system, whether you were a good citizen, whether you listened, whether you behaved. And this was thought to be a great advance because it wasn't just performative, there was some sort of interaction element. And so high schools, too, often included a morality component that was involved in the ranking. And you begin to see early introductions of grading schemes, 0 through 4 measures that are measuring like high attainment, middle attainment. And by 1837, you begin to see universities starting to assign grades for single courses. These are not really recorded in the way that we would think of now. They're still epiphenomenal, but they had one really important function. It was to select who would be the speaker on graduation day. So it's still in the idea that the primary purpose is to rank order students, not to record achievement. There's no other audience except for the college itself. And as I said, that you end up getting non-academic components. Who goes to chapel is a very common measure in this period. As I said, as we start to flirt with more colleges, if you know something about the history of higher education in the US, in the late 19th century there's an explosion of colleges and everyone's kind of doing their same thing. There are more colleges in Ohio than the entire state, the entirety of Europe by 1890. So Americans are exploding with colleges and we're trying to figure out what we do. And people begin to worry again about this question of motivation and what's really driving people's thoughts about schooling. And Horace Mann, again, very useful for critiquing these things. He says, if superior rank at recitation be the object, then as soon as that superiority is obtained, the spring of desire and of effort for that occasion relaxes. So he worried that there was too singular a focus on particular talents, and so he begins to think about other ways to record achievement and what that might look like. And he begins to think about, well, you remember the classroom, everyone of all grades is in that Lancaster model. There's no age grading. And so he develops this idea that we need grades. We need more and regular assessment. And so he begins to say that if we can develop grading systems that actually have consequences, that a student won't advance in schools, then we'll have achieved something important with our evaluation systems. He says it'll be useless for him to expect to shine only on that occasion, the one time of year where the public would gather, or only in those moments, sort of epiphenomenal, with only a radiant beam of light thrown across it here and there, while wide intervals of darkness lie between. So this idea of more consequential decisions. And so he develops this idea of the report card. So the report card, if you're wondering where that comes from, is circa 1840. And I have a specific idea in mind of what the report card is supposed to do and how it's supposed to frame thinking. And the metaphor that they use, and it's not just Horace Mann, it's reformers around the country, is the merchant's ledger. They say that monthly report cards will be like a merchant's ledger. It'll record a running total of educational success and failure and the total accumulation of educational experience. And it's from this idea that we need to shift students' focus from this sort of minute-to-minute to a longer-term investment, that we get this idea of the need to record. And of course, it's Horace Mann, so it's a very Protestant notion of an internalization, of an investment, of a future. So just to summarize this early period, early on, there's basically no incentive for standardized record keeping because students are solely the constituents of single institutions. There's almost no public pressure. The only measure of efficiency in this period is the average daily attendance, and they don't really care who it is, mostly because they got their funding based on number of pupils, so there was all the incentive in the world to cook those books. Schools are self-contained and in small ecosystems, so even when there are colleges involved, colleges and high schools mostly compete, but they're also directly linked in very small geographic spaces. And then there's a bigger thing that we often don't think about now. It's that all students took the exact same high school and college course. So the idea that we needed to document precisely what a student was doing in college or in high school was not a concern for anyone because everyone was doing the same thing. It was simply enough to provide a record of who was first and who was in the middle and all of those things. And as I say, there's no clear distinction between high school and college in this period, so there's no receiver as an educational institution of early grading systems. It's only later that we get that. So what's the impetus for change? So we begin to see some parts of the system becoming clear, but what's the broader impetus for change? And what we find is one of the major drivers is the invention of the elective system at Harvard. This is the first break where undergraduates are going to begin to take non-standard curriculum, and it becomes important to record what it is that they're taking and how well they do in it. Part of this is a response to a student need, and this idea that we invent this idea, and this becomes, I think, a challenge when we begin to rethink grading. The assumption is that all courses, though they're different, are equivalent. And this took some work organizationally to convince people that all courses were the same and all pathways through the university should be rewarded by the same success at the end. We also see things, this idea which begins at the college level, trickles down to the high school level. And we were talking at dinner, it's often the case that innovation in education comes from higher education and trickles down as high schools begin to try to mimic what universities are doing and not vice versa. A really important point in this history of the Carnegie Foundation, as usually happens in the 19th century and early 20th century, gets involved in the matter, and they create the Carnegie unit as the universal measure of student attainment. And so grades become linked with a unit of attainment, and all units are considered the same. Importantly, they established that a college is defined by the acceptance of high school credit. So this idea that by figuring out attainment and who's the audience, you actually structure the higher education and K-12 system relative to each other. High schools provide college prep. Colleges which used to run high schools can no longer offer that. And high school, you graduate from high school when you've attained a certain amount of units with a certain set of grades. So you begin to see the system come together here. Not so important now, but I think it's useful if we're thinking about electronic measures. One thing that goes throughout this entire period is how does this information get recorded in a uniform way so that people know what to do and know what they're looking at. So the NEA, the teachers' unions, convenes committees in 1880, 1884, 1888, 1901, 1905, and 1910 to produce what they call uniform records. And they're literally blanks, leaflets that they pass out to schools and colleges so that they can record attendance and things properly. And this idea of a uniform measure that people know what they're looking at and information is recorded in the same way in the same places becomes really, really important. Maybe less so now because we deal with electronic records, but it's something we need to be thinking about as we think about these grades travel. Historians talk about data friction and the problems of needing to build infrastructure so that information can move, and I think that's something that even though we're dealing with electronic records now more and more, it's still important to remember how much intellectual and organizational work it took to actually build systems like this and build infrastructures and ecosystems of schools that all shared the same record keeping. Here's a fun quote from the committee. A system of records and reports which will cement an entire state and even the nation in its educational undertakings has been recognized as one of the greatest needs. Comparable data for the state and nation must be available if we are to know our educational weaknesses on a state or national scale. So you can almost never prevent people from trying to compare with their peers, how they're doing, how they're assessing, and so uniform data becomes something that's really important with that. Okay, so by the early 19th century, we begin to have people talk about this idea that, okay, there are courses, there are transcripts, there are report cards, and there's a uniform system of grading. We see a very tight constriction in this period as we move from essentially idiosyncratic grading systems, lots of numbers, letters that include E and F, and we begin to see sort of a narrowing of the number of available systems. This is a quote from an education article in 1917. The one common language in which the scholarly attainment of pupils are expressed is a scalar one. If we who live in the Midwest read in a New York magazine that a certain man entered college with an average grade of 95, we know pretty well what that means, and so it is the country over. So this idea of mobility becomes really important. But then there's a problem. Okay, we have a standard grading system, but do we have standard graders? What do we do about the problem of the differences between institutions? And so he says the problem now presented is that of establishing a method whereby grades assigned by one teacher can be intelligently compared with those assigned by another, and all brought to a common standard. So this idea that, okay, we've standardized the form, but now have we standardized the meaning? And this is right at the time, 1917, the rise of the mental testing movement, the rise of statistics, and the idea of the normal curve. And it's interesting to watch as educators begin to struggle with, okay, early on in the 19th century, grades were explicitly about ranking students, about keeping them in order. And is it still about that? And so you see articles like this one, which is trying to make a critique of the normal code, and they want to advance something called, the normal curve, and they want to advance something called the teacher curve. And so this is an article where they say, well, this is the normal curve, but why is this curve superior to this curve, or this curve, or this curve? And why can't we create something called a teacher curve that suits our purpose? And so you begin to have conversations in educational circles about what's the proper way? What's the normative evaluation of these various measures? And of course, in different places, this is going to be taken up with different levels of seriousness. Okay, there's one other story that I think is really important that we think about, which is a changing shift in who our students are and where they're coming from. So most of the system is coming together pretty nicely by 1930, except for the Great Depression. But there's a big shock to the system in the 1940s. For the first time, you have the massification of higher education, and you have the entry of returning GIs to higher education systems. And they had been trained in non-traditional ways and intended to pursue maybe non-traditional careers. The GI Bill poses a massive collective action problem. Colleges are not sure how to handle the problem of students. The GIs, they're called the greatest generation, but the truth is, if you look at their academic record, 58% of GIs had not graduated high school. 25% of GIs had never even attended high school. So the idea of them operating in a space of higher education posed really big problems. Now, the Army had done quite a bit of work as part of their training. You could take all manner of correspondence courses, other kinds of educational exercises that involve military training. And the question was, what were colleges going to do with this kind of information? Were they going to honor it? Were they going to recognize it? How would they begin to deal with it? And so the other thing that happens with GIs is they're not interested in staying in one institution. They want to travel. They're very mobile. And so the problem of the transcript as a mobile document really enters a conversation. This problem is solved not by the government, but by a collective action among colleges, that they're going to act together to deal with the GI problem. One of the things they create is the GED as a way of certifying not individual skills, but a whole set of competencies. And it's the first really massive scale assessment of a whole range of competencies as opposed to a set of grading systems. And I think it's an interesting model. And that's developed by the American Council on Education and a set of university presidents and registrars, really, who agree on a uniform way of handling this problem. They develop, obviously, standardized measurements that they believe will capture the experiences and the ideas, not so much the content of what high school is really about. And then they provide guides, translations for how different experiences out in the world are going to translate into academic credit. And this becomes a really important, it's called the Tuttle Guide, and it becomes a really important document for how universities are going to deal with students and gradings across institutions. When one considers the tremendous amount of time, effort, and money invested in a student's education, and when it realizes that the permanent record is the single item which documents the degree, one becomes increasingly aware of the responsibility of those who are entrusted with its safekeeping. So it's this idea that for the first time, college is linked with a real important future step, and that it might not be this sort of claustrophobic space that it had been in the past. Not claustrophobic, just tight. The other thing that happens is we get a new range of institutions. And the question becomes, how do we deal with community colleges? This is the dots are the number of community colleges in 1910. This is by 1960. So you see you have a whole range of institutions, and you get the rise of the transfer student. If you're going to have non-traditional grading systems, you're going to have non-traditional pathways through college, what do you do with the student who transfers halfway through who hasn't experienced any of those? And it becomes a major conversation among educators in higher education. Education has no Linnaean system, nor even a lingua franca for communicating the nature and content of academic courses. Transferring from one educational institution to another will often test the prospective student's persistence and occasionally sporting blood. So this idea that this is really problematic, and it's something I think if we're going to rethink gradings, we should be aware of. There's an urgent need for mutual respect and cooperation carried on in an atmosphere of interdependence among institutions, having common concerns in higher education, lest more states force articulation by legislative fiat. So this idea that, and I would encourage you to think in these terms, the elite institutions have always been first movers, but they've been most successful when they recognize that when they move, they bring a whole set, a whole ecosystem of institutions with them, both community colleges, other institutions whose students are interested in coming, and then of course the K-12 system. So thinking about this articulation, because it would happen by legislative fiat, especially at state institutions like yours and mine. So I think that's an important thing to think about. So we've often talked about, and I'll wrap up here in a second, thinking about it's not that no one has ever thought about new ways of accounting for student learning or new ways of assessing it, but often those efforts have been very narrow, and the affordances of the current model have overwhelmed the value of the innovation that's provided. So the Carnegie Foundation and the American Council produced a series of reports in the 70s, and they ended up coming out in praise of the flexibility, the sort of useful ambiguity of both credits and grades that allow for us to imagine that we're all doing something the same and don't require pitched fights across universities and within universities. And so they say, the rich educational fabric, both the consequence and the reinforcer of a pluralistic culture, represents a great social strength. Conversely, an academic accounting system based on nationwide common explicit achievement units would probably diminish the diversity among institutions and probably within institutions. The credit hour accommodates both educational diversity and a commonality for expressing educational attainment. So there might be benefits to the current system that we should be aware of as we begin to think about new ways forward. And of course, there are other institutions that have tried. So the UC Santa Cruz was famous for saying, we don't have grades here. We do not want grades. And in 2000, they decided at the strong request of their student body that they institute a standard grading system. And I think one of the things that is a challenge that's lurking here is the idea that students have become convinced of the value and merits of the grades that we give them, and that one of the things that a new grading system requires is not just our acceptance among professors and administrators, but is convincing students that there's no harm in the change. And you see, at UC Santa Barbara, it was the reverse. They tried, they lasted about 4 decades, and then snapped back into place because their students wanted to go to business school. They wanted to go to law school, and they perceived this as an obstacle. So maintaining some bulwark against that kind of desire to stay in line, I think, is important. Okay, a really quick word, because no one wants to talk about accountability. It's depressing. But there is this notion that even in an era of accountability, we have quite a bit of continuity, though we need to be concerned about new programs, new kinds of offerings, and if we're going to include those in our grading systems. There's also a current desire to improve the quality of our systems, to hold ourselves accountable for better outcomes, more efficient outcomes, and we need to think about if grades are going to be the primary marker or student unit of course taking is going to be a primary marker. Where does that desire for giving an account of our work go in these new systems? And then we obviously have some new challenges, questions about privacy with digital records, and obviously, whether it's the state or federal government accountability. So just a few thoughts. Privacy, it's important to know that a lot of our records are governed by federal law, and so we want to be careful if we create new forms that they both conform with or are covered by things like FERPA, which is the first time that the federal government actually provides a definition of what constitutes a federal record. And I just flag this is quite a bit technical, but flag it as something that should be on our radar as we think through some of these ideas. There's also this question about efficiency, the need to provide data for things like iPads, things like the college rating system, and if we reorganize how we talk internally about student learning, what does the external facing vision of that student learning look like? You simply will not get away with not reporting information to the federal government. So you need to be thinking maybe at multiple levels about how that's all going to work. And then obviously there are academics who are trying to argue that we don't teach anyone anything anyway, so maybe we don't have to record it at all, being facetious. But it's something that's out there and we should be aware. And I think part of what providing a new grading system could do is to provide a better and more effective account than some of the standardized assessments that are used in its absence. Okay, so I want to leave you with a few guiding questions that maybe can help us organize our thoughts around the day. And they're really in 3 categories. The first is autonomy and control. And I want to ask or pose as something we can think on, so what governance structures are needed to address the challenges that come with new learning experiences, programs, and credentials? So if we're thinking about disaggregating student learning, providing other kinds of credentials, what kinds of governance structures do we need internally or externally to make those vibrant? And how will new forms of maybe non-school learning be incorporated into those measures? In terms of accountability and research, both external and internal, how will a reimagined student record address the needs of multiple audiences? So employers, students who want to transfer, students who have transferred in. And how will we deal with the ability to expand the capacity? So one just truism of American higher education is that we always are having an expansion of new kinds of students with new kinds of ambitions. And how will the systems that we develop accommodate those non-traditional students? How will privacy expectations be balanced with demands for research and evidence? So one of the big things about student records, about multiple people having access to a student record and maybe posting on an electronic transcript, is who owns that record? What's the privacy concern? What are the obligations of different people who all share that document? And then the last question, because this is a state institution and because the federal government often intrudes, what is the ideal role for government? So I think that one of the things that I would suggest if we're developing a new system is that innovation in higher education has always worked best when we solve a problem, develop a solution, and present it as the answer to a problem that maybe hasn't been posed to the government yet, and to get them to sign on to something that we've agreed is a good idea for the institution or the students that we serve, rather than waiting for it to come the other way around. And with that, I'll take any questions you have.
And I think we've got time for a couple of questions if people want to pose them to Ethan.
I did that well, huh? All right.
This is just more of a historical question. So you talked about the report card, I think you said in the 1840s.
40s,
What was happening internationally? I mean, report cards haven't evolved the same way in other countries. So was something similar happening at the same time elsewhere, but different?
I don't know about the history of the report card in Europe. The Europeans developed much earlier a stratified system. So this idea that one, elite students get a certain kind of education, non-elite students get another kind of education, and that it's not the kind of fluid system. There are very few colleges in Europe in this time, and so often they were simply terminal degrees. And I don't think, I think that in the 19th century they have a very similar way of reporting. I believe that man sees it in Germany on his travels and brings home this idea of a more recorded system, in part because, at least in the Prussian model, it was a much more centralized system. So the state of Massachusetts had really no interest in what was happening in individual schools in Boston, and it was exactly the opposite in Europe, where central ministries took very seriously the number of students that were involved, whether they were going to school, where they were going to school, and so they had much more extensive records. But I believe that for most of the 19th century and early 20th century, they're recording grades and attainment the same way, though they don't have the problem of the transfer student or the mobile student. It tends to be a very sort of lockstep link between institutions.
So I was really really fascinated by this. Thanks. I'm interested in the students here, really focused on GPA oftentimes. So I've done a little sort of looking around, and I've noticed that there's a real inflection point in the late 60s, early 70s, where sort of A's and C's kind of flop. And I looked at that and I thought, well, the easy thought here is, Vietnam and grading for the draft and whatnot. And I was just wondering, that is one of these things that really fascinates me about this, and you clearly have been deep into this. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I've looked into this too. It's really hard to disentangle. There are a couple of theories that people have. The one is one you mentioned, that grades get embedded. The GPA becomes a marker for all kinds of other things. So exemptions of military service, contingencies on being in good standing for student loans. And you also get, a much more diverse population and a shift in the way that colleges address their students. So they develop much more of a logic of development, of trying to nurture, as opposed to their prior stance, which was, we're going to separate the elite students from the non-elite students. And so I think it's a combination of, you read articles in the 60s and people are clearly concerned of what kinds of repercussions hang on their grades if a student falls below a C average, loses their funding, or gets drafted into the military. So that's clearly on people's minds. But I also think there's just a change in the approach that colleges have towards their students. And one of the ways that manifests is through, relaxing the grading system. A C is, you're not going to mark non-traditional students with C's. You're going to coddle them, you're going to develop them, and that's clearly part of it. But it's very hard to disentangle, and I suspect if you really get into it, different colleges would be explained by different ones of those explanations. There's the other issue that colleges suddenly become really interested in maintaining students for the cash inflow. So the federal government is putting a lot of money into schools, and for the first time, they're not having to, the college infrastructure is created by schools just hustling for students. And for the first time, the government is paying through the GI Bill, they're paying for, with student loans, and I think there's an incentive to keep those students that I think you see in the shifts in grading. Shout it out.
So coming back to the present a little bit, you mentioned UC Santa Cruz, that they had tried something alternative and it didn't work out. They went back. Do you know anything about what other institutions are doing right now? Institutions that are currently not doing an A, B, C, D, F, how well is it going? How long have they been doing it?
I mean, there are different schools that have tried different kinds of systems. I mean, Santa Cruz was notable just because it was part of the original fabric of the institution. So it wasn't a change, it wasn't a shift to something new, but it was something that, you knew that if you were going to Santa Cruz, that was how you were going to be assessed. And so I think it was shocking for a lot of people that were thinking about non-traditional measures or non-traditional grading systems to see an institution that was at its core not about that, to hear the students insist that this was important. I mean, there are other models, and usually when they are successful, they rise and fall. They are built into the brand, right? So like Colorado College has a whole way of organizing its educational experiences, and it's built into it becomes part of the brand of that school. I think that's when it works most successfully. But almost always, if you talk to people at those institutions, they say, well, our students are really worried about their GRE scores, or they're really worried about, how this stuff gets translated. And that's why I say I think a lot of it has to do with, I'm less convinced that I'd be curious to hear, I know there are employers in the room, I think a lot of it is just the perception, the fear that being out of step is always in the US and the competitive environment around colleges seen as worse. Different is always better or worse. It's never just different.
Hi, I had a question along the same line. Do you know of any universities that when they do their acceptance, they don't use GPAs as part of the acceptance criteria?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say on that is you do have states like Texas that have basically created admission systems that are based on rank, not grades. So if you graduate in the top 10% of your class in Texas, you get admission into a UT school. And so in some ways that displaces grades or the competition for GPAs across schools, but it doesn't change the fundamental fact that they're having to tell the state who the top 10% or the top 9% is. That's the only example that I can think of that involves maybe the displacement of grades, but most of the research shows that actually GPA is a better predictor of college success than like the SAT score, right? That like that your GPA is a measure of sort of continuous work. Maybe it's even a measure of your sort of social ability to work a system, and that translates better. I mean, I know if you combine GPA and SAT, you get a slightly stronger predictor, but a lot of the research shows that actually high school grades are a good measure of how students will do in college, though maybe that should or shouldn't be. But
I found it fascinating that the form of the grade really evolved from the function of the grade. So you're measuring oration, and so they need to orate in order to prove that. I think we all in this room probably have a different sense of what the most important functions of grades are now, and different stakeholders, as you mentioned, have different sense of what the function of an assessment is or what the form should be. So in your opinion, what would you say is the most important function of the assessment today?
Oh, you don't want to, I have no idea. I'm a historian, I don't know. You should ask, you have some very talented like learning scientists and developmental psychologists. I mean, I think your basic point is exactly right. That these ideas of how you record and what gets measured, that these co-create each other is absolutely dead on correct. And the question is how you can create enough play in between those things, because the reality is our students sample. They move through different courses and different, no one, it's a unique feature of the American system that when you say I major in history, in England that means like you literally take just history, right? It's not that way in our system. So we have to think about ways that are flexible. And so I think in some ways you get systems that are usefully ambiguous because it allows for that, that sort of movement through the university. And I think that's a big challenge. What does a student do if half the university says they're going to do traditional grades and half not? How do they present the collective experience to an employer or to someone else? The other thing is, if we think about the student as being a co-participant in the creation of the record or the portfolio, that changes. Colleges usually own the records. They possess them. They're the guarantor of the accuracy of the authenticity of those records. And I think there are interesting questions when you let students co-create. We have cheating scandals as it is with grades. What happens when these more elaborate measures get corrupted, unfortunately?
So with that, I want to thank Ethan for very thought-provoking remarks and a great history lesson.
Thank you.